So in permaculture design we always start from the home and build outwards. So zone 0 is the home. That could be like your inner being too. So like we were talking about earlier, getting empowered, getting informed so you can go out and affect change in your community. So that you might be zone 0. But zone 0 is your home. So you're talking about good house design, energy efficient house design, and energies that are either created on the house or piped into the house. So you might be catching solar on your roof or piping in water from a gravity fed system or something. And we can do something wherever we live. It might be we insulate our roof properly. We might put curtains and draft excluders down. We might put one of those things in our toilet system so that it uses less water. We might be able to connect our sink up to the toilet so all the water from our sink goes to fill up the toilet to flush it. We might collect our shower water and water the garden with it. So lots we can do around the home about energy efficiency. And then around that is zone 1, which you all found in your things. You put the things closest to your house that you're going to visit a lot of times. So this is all that energy efficiency planning is. It's common sense. You put the things that you're going to need to visit a lot of times right next to your back door. So like your herbs, you can just nip out while you're cooking salad, herbs, in you go. Easy. Things like orchards, you don't need to go too often, so put them further away. Makes sense, right? It's pretty clear and obvious. So things like intensive veg, chickens, seedlings, compost, greenhouse would all go right near the house in zone 1. Zone 2 would include things like dwarf fruit trees. So you get different sizes of fruit trees, usually depending on the rootstock that they're grown on. So they'll never actually grow very big, or they might be semi-dwarfing, so they're medium-sized. So close to your home you want to keep your dwarf fruit trees that need pruning more regularly. Big trees that you're just leaving to go wild, like chestnuts and walnuts, whatever, you might just
also use that as a wind barrier too.
You might be using it as a wind barrier. You might want to use a wind barrier to protect your orchard crop, because you might blow all your blossom off.
Yeah, of course.
You might not, depends where you are. Things like your main crops, hedges, ponds for biodiversity you might find. Yeah. This is not a strict thing. That you might have a pond right outside your house to keep it cool, or because it looks nice, or whatever. So it's just an idea of what might go in these zones. Moving out to zone 3, you get things like animal shelters, broadacre crops. So if you're growing wheat, if this was a family homestead, you're trying to provide all your own food. You grow your wheat further away where you don't really need to go often. Big water storage, windbreaks to protect the inner zones. Green manures, bigger trees, that sort of thing. Zone 4 is where you meet your fuel needs. So you might be growing a woodlot to produce firewood, and you might be cooking on firewood. On my boat that we live on now, we've got this 1950s Arga, and it costs 50 quid, burns on wood, does all our cooking, all our heating. It's only about this big, but it could heat 8 radiators in a house. It's designed for a house. And so I chop wood for free, and you know, wood is a great sustainable resource. You might have forage crops for animals, pasture for animals, and big dams, maybe big water storage. And then the last sort of zone is zone 5, which is wilderness. So allowing part of your land to go back to nature, as it were, to evolve in succession in whatever way it chooses. And like we saw on that film yesterday, those of you that are here, the predominant apex ecosystem or climax ecosystem in the UK is woodland. So if you leave any piece of land long enough, it will turn to wood, even if it's a car park. The fungi will break down the tarmac, small plants that don't need many nutrients will come in, and you'll get this succession going on that will eventually lead to the forest. That's the climax community, pretty much anywhere on Earth. So leaving some of that for nature. So we've got, you know, if we leave 10% of our land to nature, we know that we're going to have biodiversity, insects, natural habitats for creatures, and we're not going to touch it, so they're going to be able to sustain their populations. So it's like having some buffer. It might be that that acts as a buffer from the GM farm next door, stops seeds coming in and pollinating our crops. This is a major concern, just going off track slightly, thinking about GM food. If any of you have watched any of the films about GM crops, I mean, it's incredibly scary. But they basically, if you have a GM crop, you can patent it. And then what happens is the big companies like Monsanto that own all these patents often deliberately cross-pollinate crops with their own, and then they can go into the field and test it and say, look, this has got our genes in, therefore it's our crop, so you owe us 40% of your crop, and you've got to buy seeds off us next year, because these are seeds that won't produce their own seed. They went down to Mexico, where corn is wind pollinated. Corn in Mexico is like the breadbasket of all corn production. Hundreds of varieties, literally from field to field you get different varieties that have been bred to grow specifically in that field for generations. They wind pollinated corn deliberately and wiped out about 80% of the corn diversity in a few years. And then they own the farmers basically, and that's happened all over the poor places. You don't hear much about it. You still hear, there's something happened in the news recently about them pushing through for GM. People will argue that we need GM to feed the world's population. It's absolute junk. Like there's no argument for GM food. Like there's absolutely no argument for it. It's nothing like plant breeding. People will argue that it's no different to breeding plants, but it's totally different. It's plant breeding either works or it doesn't. You can get inside a plant and genetically engineer it. It's totally different ballgame. So just a little rant about that. It's definitely not good. So part of disaster planning is you might need to protect your land. It might be for more simple things like pollution. You know, if you've got a stream coming through your land that's full of toxic waste, how are you going to clean that? Things like that. And then zone 6 I add on because I think it's important is like community networks. So all your networks, all your community, things like the internet, they're like more ethereal things, but we're all connected to them in some way.